So far, we've learned about LGBTQ plus identities, we've explored our own identities, we've talked about ways to make our classroom more LGBTQ plus inclusive, we talked about bystander intervention, and now we're going to zoom out a bit and look at how we can be a part of building inclusive schools and larger communities outside of our schools as well. So in building LGBTQ plus inclusive schools, we want to think about our coworkers and administrators too. We've talked a lot about so far how we can support our students and things we can do in terms of active allyship for them, but we also need to think about our coworkers and administrators, those who identify as LGBTQ plus and those that don't. Because everyone in a school community, whether it be coworkers or your students or even alumni, they can all serve as active allies as well. So it's important just to start conversations with them about LGBTQ plus issues. So these can be formal conversations about school policies and, kind of brainstorm sessions about different things you think we could change about policies, things like that. Or you could talk about local, state, national legislation. There's so many different pieces of legislation in the news right now that affect LGBTQ plus people. And those could certainly be talked about, and you could brainstorm action steps on ways you can get involved or ways that you can advocate for the LGBTQ plus community. And you can also just have more casual conversations as well. For example, if you have a coworker at school who identifies as LGBTQ plus, just talk to them. It doesn't even have to be about something specific about LGBTQ plus issues, but if they bring up, wanting a faculty staff affinity group, for example, help them start that, just little things like that. Even just super casual conversations are super important, again, because it normalizes those conversations and just the topics in general. Again, make sure you call out any homophobic or transphobic language, even when there are no students around. So again, this relates to what we learned about for bystander intervention. And, correct people if they misgender a student or another coworker. You continue your active allyship, not just when students are around, but in your daily life and conversation. So, your active ally cape, for example, your superhero cape, since you're all superheroes, that doesn't come off when you leave the classroom. That should be on all the time. And whether it's actually talking to a coworker and correcting them, or even just in your daily life, if someone you hear misgender someone, or just misrepresents them, or if there's a microaggression or something, you can still wear that active ally cape, and in fact you should, to correct that language or that behavior, because again, that's how active allyship continues, and that's how active allyship almost becomes contagious when people are hearing those types of examples and that type of bystander intervention on a regular, normal daily life basis. That makes a really big impact. And then a couple other points to add would be to introduce your students to other coworkers with their correct name and pronouns, again, to normalize it, and just generally be aware of how you and your students might be preventing access to important resources for students. So, for example, avoid using gender-neutral student bathrooms if that's something that's available to you on your school campus. So then this slide is an important one, the one about inclusive policies and infrastructure, because it lists several specific ways to develop inclusive policies and infrastructure within your schools for both students and anyone in the school community, really. So there are several important ideas here that can be implemented in the actual school beyond your classroom that everyone should abide by. But here are some things that you could do to bring up with administration, or again, talk to your coworkers about. So one thing would be changing administrative records to reflect a student's or person's correct name and pronouns, and offering more inclusive options for their gender or other identities in those records too. So I know that technologically I've heard that can be pretty difficult, but if that is something that's possible, that's something that can be really, really big in honoring not just students, but also other members of the community. In terms of, for example, if there's a parent, not making them list Mr. or Mrs. Or, for example, if a student has chosen a new name to go by, a new chosen name, then that and their pronouns, if they want to share them, can be on actual administrative records, so that if a sub comes in, or even the teacher or another teacher or something, they're all on the same page about how this student would like to be addressed, and that correctly reflects their identity. That's super important in terms of having students and other community members feel seen. Another thing, again, we've talked about several times, but regularly using students or people's chosen names and pronouns and encouraging others to do the same, and stepping in when others don't, of course. Adding more gender neutral or all gender restrooms, locker rooms, or other facilities. There are often so many conversations about gender neutral bathrooms and how valuable they are, and not reinforcing that binary of enforcing a student to choose between a male or a female bathroom, but just making everything gender neutral. Again, that normalizes it. But we need to expand that conversation to other facilities that folks might use. And especially in the middle school and high school area, there are definitely locker rooms and other facilities that could be made gender neutral, just to be made more inclusive, and to have students not be as uncomfortable if they are exploring their gender, or just to set that norm of, this is a gender neutral campus. And then developing and implementing anti-biased and inclusive hiring practices that ensures that your faculty/staff will have a diverse representation of all identities, and specifically the LGBTQ plus community. So that's something I know that some schools are working on now as well, to make sure their hiring practice are a little more anti-bias. But just making sure you have representation of all identities. That's something that's important for every school, regardless of what type of school or age or anything like that of the students. So, and then it's also important to think about the access that students and staff have to supportive spaces on campus. So whether that be affinity groups or student clubs, or even faculty staff clubs, or physical spaces to go to. And that goes hand in hand with ensuring that all students and staff have access to mental health support on and off campus as well. That's an area that I think schools could work on in terms of school policies, is making sure that there are those supportive spaces, and even just intentional time set aside for those affinity groups, so that faculty and staff can attend them and students can attend them, because they are incredibly important in building that affinity and that sense of belonging on campus. And then, of course, mental health support too, making sure that's a part of like the faculty staff benefits plan, for example, or something like that. So I wanted to share just a bit of information that I found from a study by UT Austin, and the study was conducted in 2018. And just wanted to give a brief content warning that there is a mention of suicide in here. And so just wanted to mention that briefly before I share the quote that I have. But in this study, they said that trans people who are able to use their chosen name in any single context in their life, such as at school or at their work, experienced 71% fewer symptoms of severe depression, 34% decrease in reported thoughts of suicide, and 65% decrease in suicidal attempts. So that stat right there is huge. You can see that trans people, whether it's actual students at school or if it's coworkers or whoever, if they are able to live as their authentic self and use their chosen name and pronouns, and have that not be an issue, they are less likely to experience severe depression, thoughts of suicide, or even try suicide attempts. So that's a really important stat to keep in mind about these inclusive policies and infrastructure. And then lastly, there should be inclusive and updated dress code policies and specific equitable protocols for how teachers and administrators should address and handle LGBTQ plus mistreatment, harassment, reporting, Title IX and mandated reporter training. That's something that I have actually had to go through myself, experiencing Title IX harassment. And that is something that I have definitely seen that people could use more training and understanding of, given how Title IX has evolved over the years. And yeah, having actual specific written out policies about how things will be handled for LGBTQ plus mistreatment. I think it's very important to have it be very specific and to have it laid out exactly, so that it takes some of the work off of the reporting or just the emotional burden off of the person that's affected, and there are clear policies in place and protections in place. So having said that, we're going to, in terms of building inclusive communities with parents, this can be a tricky aspect for sure, but they are certainly a part of a school community as well, and an important part of a school community. So there might not always be a level of buy-in that you'd hope from parents, but here are just a few tips. And the first one would be just making sure you always check in with your students before talking to their parents about gender or sexual identity, because you don't want to inadvertently out someone. So just make sure you check in with your student on what they actually need, what type of support you can provide. And then obviously if additional support is needed through school counselors or having conversations with the parents, that you have resources and you have support. But again, just building those authentic relationships with students and building that trust and making sure you communicate with them beforehand, before talking to parents, or just because you might not be aware of the full situation and what their relationship is like. Another thing would be to stand up for your students if they're having difficulty with their parents. So you can be a really valuable and important ally to LGBTQ plus students by helping talk through things with their parents if that's what they want. If they would like you to advocate for them, then you could be a really valuable asset in helping them ease some of the discomfort around that. Or you can support the student in them talking to their parents. So for example, you could give the student some resources to pass on to their parents, or you could give parents resources to learn more about LGBTQ plus identities. We have so many resources listed in our toolkits and other resource documents that you could easily just send them some of those if they really need help with language or just understanding. And another thing you could do is go to your supervisor and administrator and create opportunities for professional development for parents if they want even more knowledge on it. You could find workshops they could attend to further educate themselves on LGBTQ plus identities, or you could suggest starting a parent affinity group for LGBTQ plus parents so they feel more involved in developing school policies and bringing up certain things that they want discussed. Or even parent kind of like DEI groups focused on gender and sexuality, where they can discuss these topics more with other parents and they can all learn together. Those are really special learning opportunities that could give parents some more information about the stuff you're talking about in classrooms and why it's important, but it could also just further their own self-education, which is important as well.